Good morning, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank very much indeed the organisers, Cerebra, for inviting me along to speak on behalf of all my many colleagues at the Institute of Psychological Medicine and Clinical Neurosciences at Cardiff University. So it's a great honour and a privilege to be here. I'm not used to speaking to quite so many people, so forgive me if I'm a bit nervous. But the plan this morning is to just offer you an overview of two unrelated studies that have been going on at the Institute, one more recently than the other, and the third study, which is looking not so much at mental health problems with children with genetic disorders, but looking at parents' experiences of services and how they get their information about mental health and other problems related to their child's diagnosis. Just look at how this thing works. So that's the building that I live in or work in. I actually virtually live in there sometimes. It's the Hayden Ellis building at the university on the Maindee Road, the Innovation Campus. And it's the home to three institutes, the National Centre for Mental Health, which is funded by the Wales NHS, the neuroscience, the Centre for Neuropsychiatric Genetics and Genomics, the MRC Centre, which is directed by Professor Sir Mike Owen. And where I live is on the top floor with a grand view, if I had a window, is a Neuroscience and Mental Health Research Institute, which is like a translational research centre, feeding off all the genetic discovery that goes on in the MRC Centre. So it's a great place where it brings all of these experts in genetics, in psychiatry, in neuroscience, and in healthcare and in medical genetics and into one building. So it's a very exciting place to work. But before I moved there about 18 months ago, I worked as a genetic counsellor in the NHS, working in a variety of areas, including cancer genetics. But I've always been very interested in mental health, both to work in it clinically as a genetic counsellor, also to work in research, because I'm aware there's a lot less research is done in this field, a lot less funded than cancer genetics, but we can see how research has led to amazing improvements in how cancer is understood and treated, prevented and cured. So it's a fantastic opportunity to be involved in this area. So the plan is basically to talk a little bit about why the Institute has a particular focus on genetic conditions that contribute to neurodevelopmental disorders, alongside its huge investment in trying to understand the genetics and the biology of more common mental health conditions and how the two relate to each other. There's a particular interest, obviously, with Mike Owen in the directorship with schizophrenia, but we'll talk about the childhood disorders mostly today. I'll give you a taster of the research the team I work for is all about. And to do that, I'd like to just start with a quick story. One of the first visits I did as part of one of the studies I'm involved, which is called Imagine, which is about intellectual disability and mental health and genetics. I met Jack, he's about 6 years old when I met him, and he has mild to sort of moderate learning problems. And he was this year he was held back a year at school because of this and other problems. He has behavioural problems, which are quite challenging. He can be aggressive verbally and physically towards his parents. He has a lot of attention and communication problems and social interaction. He has some language delay as well. And he shows some signs of having attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and autism spectrum disorder, but he's never had a proper diagnosis of any of these conditions. He was conceived with IVF, in vitro fertilization, because his father has a few problems, and he also has a life-limiting condition, which is another concern for the family. Now, as is typical in a child having these sorts of problems, his paediatrician eventually requested that he have some genetic analysis to see whether they could find anything that might help to explain this unusual pattern of symptoms in his behaviour in particular, although he has some physical problems as well. And see if anything could be done that might help the family, give a better idea about his outlook, improve the diagnosis, any treatments that might be helpful, and what services he could get access to. So paediatricians can request these so-called genetic microarray tests to help the diagnosis nowadays, rather than having to send them to genetics to get it done there in the first place. Now, most boys have a pattern of chromosomes. This is where all your genetic material is stored. It looks a bit like this, and they have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. Now, we don't actually use this technique anymore. We use much more molecular and much more high-definition techniques to understand changes in our genes to help the diagnosis of a condition. But Jack, they found, has two of these X chromosomes rather than just the one. So he has an extra one, and this is something that's called Klinefelter Syndrome. Now, that's quite a common, in fact, it's the most common chromosome abnormality in man. It affects about 1 under 500 live births. But that doesn't quite fit, and some of the conditions, problems he's got, doesn't quite match up with Klinefelter syndrome. It might explain some of his behaviour problems, some of his physical health problems that he's got. So it was a bit unclear as to whether that really was a proper and complete diagnosis. But with the advantage of modern sort of molecular analysis, he actually had two findings, and the second one was a tiny piece which you couldn't see down the microscope on chromosome 1, a tiny piece of the long arm of chromosome 1 was missing. It's called 1q, and the full address is 1q21.1, and it's a microdeletion, and it deletes about 330 kilobases of chunk of DNA with several genes, and deletion of that region is known to be associated with some emotional, psychiatric and behavioural problems in children and in adults. So he's got two genetic findings, which is very unexpected, and they consider Jack to be pretty unique. He might not be the only person in the world with both those conditions, but it certainly came as a surprise to them, and they weren't quite sure what to do about this, but they were relieved to get some kind of explanation as to why he had those problems, rather than having no diagnosis and no psychiatric or psychological diagnosis. So it was some help to them, but by the time they got to see the genetics clinic about a year later, after having been given these results by the paediatrician in the first place, they've gone off onto the internet and they'd found out much more about this themselves, about both problems. So by the time they got to see a geneticist, they kind of didn't really want to learn much more. They didn't want to be tested for themselves to see whether mum or dad had this condition. You can't really test to see where that came from. It's a spontaneous event. Their main concern really was what's going to happen in the future. How are they going to get the best for their son, and what's his outlook? And all the kinds of things they said to me were, I was thinking about this afterwards and listening to the recording that we did and all the assessments that we did. And it was very much in line with things that people say when we ask them in the survey, I'll talk about at the end, is what worries you most about your child's condition? And it was these things like the future, independence, school, life issues, disability, those kinds of things. But the key thing is what's going to happen in the future. And the hope is that from understanding the genetic causes of neurodevelopmental problems and related problems, understanding the genetics and therefore the biology, we can say much more about what will happen in the future and do a lot more to improve services and related things and support in particular. Now, that's the preamble. I'll give you a bit of context about what kinds of things that we do at the university in the study of intellectual disability. Excuse me. So just very quickly, why study rare? Well, we know that neurodevelopmental disorders and mental health problems in particular have very high rates, very high heritability. In other words, there's a very big genetic contribution to a lot of these disorders, particularly the more severe ones like autism, spectrum disorder, clinical ADHD, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. So genetics has a major contribution to the development of these conditions. But it's very complex. And I don't want to try and spend too much time on this slide because it's a bit complicated. But a lot of focus is on trying to understand what's called common genetic variation in the population. We all have huge amounts of variation in our genes, and some of that variation contributes to a variety of complex genetic conditions like schizophrenia, but also things like diabetes, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, rheumatoid arthritis, things like that. So that's very important in trying to understand the genetics and the biology of these complex disorders, which are a major burden on human health, particularly in the Western world. There are very rare genetic changes that have a very big effect on the development of illness, but these common variants are common in the population at more than one, and going on towards 5 and 10, 15% of the population have these variations, but they have a very small effect on the development of these diseases. That's a very complex area of investigation, requires huge samples, 50,000 or so, just to understand a third, perhaps, of the genetic contribution towards a disease like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. So they're massively complex investigations. What we've learned more recently is that these little deletions, like the 1q21 I showed you that Jack has, these are actually another area of not completely rare genetic changes that humans have, and they do make a very significant contribution towards the development of neurodevelopmental disorders. So the more that a person has of these, the more likely they are to have a developmental condition, and the bigger they are and the more that they have, the more severe their symptoms are likely to be. So this area here, it's been felt that is, can you see my pointer? That's it. That studying people with these genetic changes might be more easy to do than studying people with these, to really understand that link between genetic changes and the biology and their behaviour. Also, people with the same genetic change that has a major contribution towards their problems might be a more homogeneous group of people, and we can make much more direct correlations between their genetics and their behavioural and psychiatric outcomes. So really get down into the biology, rather than studying huge numbers of variations of uncertain significance and weak effect. So we know that the architecture of developmental disorders is highly complex and incompletely understood. As I said, that common variation probably only explains about a third of the entire picture, nearly a third of the genetics of these conditions. Correlating those changes with behavioural psychiatric traits is very challenging. So we need genes with much stronger contributions to individual risk of neurodevelopmental disorders, or NDD as I've abbreviated it. So we want to focus on these high-risk variants, and those are very rare in the population. And one of those classes of variants, so like the 1q21 deletion, is commonly known as these copy number variants, or CNVs. And they are linked to a number of neurodevelopmental disorders. A significant component of the overall genetic architecture to NDD is constituted by these CNVs. And they just about occur frequently enough in the population, with a lot of effort, to develop cohorts of these individuals in which to make very detailed clinical, psychiatric and cognitive studies. So that's the proposition for building large, or the idea behind building very large, well-characterized cohorts of individual CNVs. And that should deliver very significant, hopefully, insights into the biological mechanisms of these disorders. And essentially, that was the basis on which groups of people, including us in Cardiff, or before I joined 18 months ago, long before that, to develop these large-scale studies of neurodevelopment, focusing on these rare but recurrent genetic changes in the population. And they promised to tell us a lot about the natural history of particular rare developmental disorders. And to begin with, the focus was on, this was going back a few years, was on a condition called 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, or some people know it as velocardiofacial syndrome, or even DiGeorge syndrome. It's all the same thing. And this is another one of these little deletions, but on chromosome 22 instead. And it's a bit bigger than the one on chromosome 1. It's about 3 megabases, it's about 10 times the size. And it deletes about 60 genes. Now, which one of those are important in this condition, we don't really know. There are some hints of some of these might be more important than others on the way that the brain develops. But it's not uncommon that uncommon in the population. Somewhere between maybe as many as 1 in 1,000 live births have a deletion at 22q11.2. But they're all pretty much identical. So these children have very much identical genetic contribution towards their problems. But they have very complex problems. They have over 200 reported health problems associated with the condition. And included in those are learning disability, autism spectrum disorder, ADHD. A lot of kids have anxiety problems. And about a quarter to up to a third of individuals go on to develop schizophrenia as well, which is commonly regarded now as a neurodevelopmental disorder. They also suffer from seizures, and there's some very recent evidence to suggest that they may also, later on, some may develop Parkinson's disease. But which children, adults will develop which of these problems is really uncertain. There's huge variability, even for a condition with ostensibly pretty much the same genetic change, which is making the biggest overall contribution to why these problems occur. But it may not be the only contribution. So that was the basis of the investigation, because of this high risk of psychiatric disorder. So there was a great drive to sort of collect very large numbers of these individuals and focus on the problems that they have. So this led to this the first study that I'll talk about. I'll give you some sort of very brief look at some of the results we've had for 22q. And it's a study called the ECHO study. It's led by Professor Marianne Vandenbrie, who I'm here on behalf of today. And it's the long-term name for it is the experience of children with copy number variations. And the aims are to define the nature and prevalence and variation of behavioural, psychiatric, neurocognitive problems associated with copy number variants. Initially, just focusing on one CNV, 22q, that are associated with a high risk of neurodevelopmental conditions, including schizophrenia, and try to really disentangle these interrelationships between these mental health traits and correlate them with this genetic condition, this genetic change. So we do a lot of other stuff as well as the sort of cognitive and psychiatric assessments of children. We do additional genetic analysis on them. We look at the expressions of genes in their cells, and we try to establish links between the structural and functional brain abnormalities by doing brain imaging, MRIs, and related scans. And we also, if possible, we obtain cell samples from them to produce these so-called pluripotent stem cells. So we take cells from the skin, from a hair follicle, and we can turn them into neurons in the laboratory and start to study the behavior of neurons in the laboratory and link that back to the genetics and their behaviors. So that requires a big building, so that's why we're very pleased to be able to have that technology in Cardiff now. The approach basically is we recruit children with a initially 22q, but as I'll say later on, we've got other CNVs we're studying now, including 1q21. Children between the age of 6 and 17 years, and we also like to recruit an unaffected sibling, the one that's closest in age as well, to make comparisons between the two. The recruitment has been mostly through the NHS from genetic services, but also from other services, and also from some of the charities. And for 22q, we've been delighted by the support we've had from Max Appeal, 22 Crew, and also from Unique, who've been tremendous in their support, obtaining and encouraging their members of 22Q to join the study. We mostly visit people in their homes, and two highly trained psychologists and other staff go along and do the assessments together, and we make developmental, behaviour, cognition, and psychiatric assessments. So there's a very large list. We spend 4, 5, 6 hours plus the travel in between, and it's a national study, so we have to go a long way. But these are the kinds of assessments that go on with these families over time. The key thing being the psychiatric assessment, and we use the CAPA, which is a parent interview about the child's strengths and weaknesses. These are face-to-face interviews with the parent or the primary carer. We also have a self-report for older children who have language and can tell us about their own experiences. And all of the assessments are supervised by a child and adolescent psychiatrist. We do a whole battery of neurocognitive assessments, including IQ tests and high executive function planning and attention, memory, and general performance, which is we use the CANTAB. This is a computer-based assessment tool for that, so get an idea about their IQ and intelligence and learning and thinking. We also do a number of other questionnaires. So we look at the child's physical health problems and the history of their condition over time. We look at family size, family history, and structure. We look at things like social class, family relations, parenting, and then the pregnancy history. We also do some interviews to assess autistic features. And then we also do get reports from the teachers as well. So we're covering a whole range of potential inputs into understanding the impact of these genetic changes. So just very briefly, what we found just looking at 22q, we now have, this data is based on about 80 individuals with a mean age of about 10. We find the shift in IQ of about 30 points. But what we notice is that they perform worse in most all other cognitive tests as well as IQ, but they show huge variability in their IQ scores. So the green ones are their siblings, and the blue ones are 22QDS. So there's massive variability in IQ, from down to 50 to as high as 140. And why is that? We don't have the answer to that yet. But it's a very interesting observation, and these studies have mostly been led by Maria Nachu and published in British Journal of Psychiatry a couple of years ago. We also looked at psychopathology or mental health problems in 22q. And we see very high rates of ADHD compared to their siblings who don't carry the deletion. We see oppositional defiant disorder and high rates of anxiety and autism spectrum. But we also see we've seen delusional disorder in 2 children, and we also have evidence of social phobia and specific phobias and agoraphobia, obsessive compulsive disorder in 3 of these individuals, and as I said, generalized anxiety and separation anxiety as well. So a lot of psychopathology, a lot of co-occurrence of mental health problems. In terms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, we see more in terms of inattention than we do in terms of hyperactivity compared to individuals who are assessed in the clinic who don't have 22q. So we feel this might be important information for clinicians to help recognizing ADHD in 22q1 or 2 cases that they see. We see about a quarter of individuals have autism and low levels obviously in their siblings. But the different classes of autism spectrum disorders is perhaps slightly different to you might expect in the general population. There are significant problems with social interaction and communication, but rather less in terms of repetitive and stereotypic behaviours. So this perhaps slightly different in its presentation to other situations. So what we have found, what's very noticeable, is that this co-occurrence, and this is a feature of a lot of what's going to be said today, of neuropsychiatric problems in 22q. And only 19 out of the sort of 32 in this particular analysis had no co-occurrence, but there's a lot of individuals, like 10% of them had all 4 of these diagnoses, and if you can see them, so there's ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, and any anxiety disorder. So a great deal of co-occurrence going on. So we wanted to ask this question, and it's an important question, I think. Are behavioural and emotional problems simply sort of the consequences of reduced IQ and learning and thinking? Or does, in other words, does learning disability mediate psychopathology? And that's an important question. Or are these independent events? Is a psychiatric problem independent of their problems with intellectual development? So is it mediated by learning disabilities, or are these independent traits? So we did this mediation, we performed these mediation tests with Professor Van den Brie and her colleagues, and there's very clear evidence, categorical evidence, that these are independent impacts for all of the psychopathologies that were analysed, and that is autism spectrum, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and anxiety. And the indirect effects mediated by IQ are substantially weaker than the direct effects on psychopathologies due to the disorder. And the only exception was one of the tests on sorting cards with minimal moves on the Cantab test, when there was some evidence of an effect in autism spectrum. But when you corrected for multiple testing, that effect went away. We also are looking at changes over time as well. So we have 2 second and third wave visits to children with 22q. So we see them 2.5 and 5 years later, and we're performing IQ tests and also looking at psychopathology over the long term to get a better picture about the trajectory of their problems. And although it's complex, each individual each line is one individual at 2 different time points. And overall, what we're seeing is that there's lots of variability in children with 22q and their siblings, but there's no significant difference or change in IQ over time. So that the mean time age at time 1 is about 10 years, and at time 2 is about 12.5 years. And also looking at psychopathology, most of this work's been done by Samuel Chawner, who's just graduated with a PhD in the Institute. and this is a manuscript he's writing up at the moment. We look at psychopathology, and interestingly, there appears to be a fall in the rate of ADHD between these two time points. Most of the others, there's not a great deal of change, but there is some evidence now that psychotic experiences are increasing, which perhaps you might expect to see given this association with or linkage with schizophrenia later on. But these are very early findings. Importantly, mean IQ was almost exactly the same in individuals who don't have psychiatric problems compared to individuals who do. So the conclusions are, obviously children with 22q have lower school achievement, have lower IQ scores than their non-carrier siblings, and they have more difficulties with learning and thinking and reasoning and remembering. They have a very wide range of IQ scores, but they don't experience any significant fall in IQ, at least over the time points that we've measured it so far. Just over half meet the criteria for having one or more DSM psychiatric disorder, which means nearly half don't have any psychiatric problems at all on the positive side. The greater risk of mental health problems, particularly ADHD, anxiety, and autism spectrum. There's no increase, with the exception of psychosis, of mental health problems over time at the moment, but there are some problems maybe different from those children without the deletion. And there's less hyperactive behavioural problems in ADHD. Psychiatric problems and IQ are independent, largely independent of the effects of the deletion. And pathology, in other words, psychopathology is not mediated by having learning impairments. And the risk of psychological problems is not higher in children with lower IQ. So in summary, physical and mental health and intellectual outcomes are highly variable and complex. There's a lot of co-occurrence in 22q. There's more variation in IQ than non-carrier siblings, as I said, and there are very high risks of mental health problems overall. But as I said, almost half have no psychiatric diagnosis. There are some behavioural problems occur less than in other children in the general population, so there's very little evidence of any conduct disorder in 22q. We also have studies looking at some of the other problems that these kids experience, largely sleep disorders, motor coordination, and seizures as well. So there's still a long way to go with 22q. The second study is really sort of an evolution of the ECHO study, which we began to collect other copy number variants, other chromosome deletions and related changes to try and look at a broader picture of these fairly rare genetic changes in relation to mental health. And the inspiration was that from some of the more modern sort of genetic analysis of people with mental health problems, as well as discovering this huge genetic variation, this discovery of other genetic changes like 22q that occur in a significant proportion of people with neurodevelopmental problems. So we wanted to really expand the study and start to look at those as well. So last year we had funding from the MRC to run a collaborative project called Imagine ID, or intellectual disability and mental health, and assessing the sort of the genetic impact on neurodevelopment. The key aims of this study were to identify key sort of phenotypic, in other words, observable traits as consequences of having a genetic diagnosis related to learning disability, and in order to better inform the prognosis and develop guidance on more effective management and family support, very important, to identify specific genetic and physical and cognitive predictors of mental health outcomes, and to identify environmental and social factors related to risk and protective mechanisms. And the big aim is to establish a knowledge base linking these markers, these biomarkers, in particular at the beginning anyway, of looking at the CNV associated with the diagnosis, to standardized measures of behavioral and emotional adjustment and their mental health. So that will be a legacy database that will develop over the next 4 to 5 years, which will become publicly available for additional research. So so it just shows some of the other copy number variants, and if you can see them particularly clearly, but the 1q21 deletion that Jack had, some of the other more common ones, 15q11.2, there's DeJours, VCFS again, and the 16p11.2 deletions and duplications. So a bigger range. Obviously, this isn't a complete set of CNVs associated with neurodevelopment, but these are the ones, or with learning disability rather, but these are the ones that have much higher risks of psychiatric problems, and those are the ones that we really wanted to focus on. After a successful year of the pilot study funded by MRC and this sort of collaborative group between Cardiff and University of Cambridge and the Institute of Child Health at UCL, we managed to recruit 500 individuals in a year, do all the ethics, set up a website, and build a sort of a collaboration with support groups in the NHS. So we were very pleased to get full funding to recruit 5,000 participants aged 4 to 17 with a learning disability and a genetic diagnosis, and recruit those over the next 4 to 5 years. All of these individuals will be invited to do an online psychiatric questionnaire called the DORBA, or the Developmental and Wellbeing Assessment, and a summary of that report is sent to the parents, and the feedback we got from the pilot is they find this extremely useful and helpful information that they've never been had access to before. The Cardiff group do face-to-face assessments of individuals with these specific CNVs. The study overall is recruiting any CNV into the study. So those are the CNVs we're looking at in summary. And very early on, just from very preliminary findings we had from the studies, is that again we're seeing significant changes in IQ compared to controls for some of the CNVs we've got data on, including some very rare ones like the 9q34 with Klinefelter Syndrome. Psychopathology, again, highly complex and variable. So that 15q, which was up until quite recently, many genetic centres didn't regard as a susceptibility locus for neurodevelopmental and behavioural problems. We've seen very high rates of psychopathology and a very mixed picture. So this is no longer classed as a finding of uncertain significance that some genetic centres previously considered it to be. So just more variation there, as you see. We're also seeing from the face-to-face assessment, seeing some evidence of psychotic experiences which have previously been reported by groups like the Simons Foundation in the United States. So these are very early findings, but this has required a sort of a really heavy sort of engagement with genetic services. They've been undergoing a huge number of changes recently with the way that the services are constructed and this whole move to sort of genetic medicine. So getting them to come on board with the study and send us their patients who've had a genetic diagnosis has been very painstaking but ultimately successful. And we're very pleased that they're very engaged. But Unique were really helpful in getting the whole study off the ground, sending us their families again. Just finally, I just want to talk about information sources and experiences of services that I mentioned at the beginning. And this was inspired by some of the anecdotes we had from individuals in the study of 22q11.2, and Professor Vandenbury and her colleagues noted that there was a lot of variability in how people got their information and also variability in their experiences of services. So they conducted a survey of where parents got their information and what awareness levels they had. So for physical and developmental problems, awareness was very high, but rather less so for psychiatric problems like ADHD and anxiety and schizophrenia. But if you look at where they got their information, most of the information for the sort of presenting problems like heart defects, palatal defects, kidney problems, information has come in nearly 2/3 of cases from the clinician, either at the diagnosis or at the follow-up period. The rest of it has come from the internet. This is the first place they go to or first place they receive their information. But for psychiatric problems, 40% or more, for most of the disorders concerned, information was gleaned from the internet in the first instance, and very little at the point of diagnosis or follow-up with a clinical specialist. And that was really interesting. And that's just on for 22q11.2, which is a highly complex condition. This inspired a bigger study of any individual whose child has a genetic diagnosis of their problems. And we want to sort of understand their awareness of health problems from whatever source. Where is their information source? Is it helpful? How about services for rare disorders? How good are they? What could be improved? And the approach we've developed is to develop another online survey using the Bristol online survey scheme. And about 170 parents have completed the survey. We're also offering the opportunity to come to have a face-to-face interview. So we've interviewed about 50 parents of this condition, with these children with these conditions. We also interviewed leaders of support groups, and a number of geneticists and genetic counsellors have stepped up and said they'd like to tell us about their own view from the health service side of things. And we're also hoping to interview paediatricians as well. And we're getting a very similar picture. We find that the majority of the time people are obtaining their information firstly from the internet. But there's a great variability here, but there's rather less information coming from clinicians. And this is a bit of a complex cobweb of a picture, but these are the sorts of areas of information people we've asked them about. But there's much more awareness about developmental delay of speech and language, and much more information in blue coming from clinicians. But the less awareness there was, more information seems to be sought from the internet and other sources. So there's much less awareness of these behavioural and psychological problems for these parents, which we find is very interesting. We haven't done any detailed analysis of this yet, it's still ongoing. So was it helpful, the information? So the majority of time where people did get information from the internet, they thought it was very helpful. And overall, they thought it was very helpful. But if you look at the level of unhelpfulness of information for some clinicians, it's a bit of a worrying trend. Support groups seem to do extremely well. Support groups do very well in terms of very, very few people find the information for them unhelpful. So that's a very interesting finding. So I'll just, there's more awareness of physical and developmental problems rather than mental health problems. They learn about schizophrenia and psychosis mostly from the internet, not from professionals. And many parents discover information about developmental delay via non-professional sources. And most get insufficient information from clinicians. And most say, that seems to appeal to most people here, and it resonates quite strongly. Most say what they do receive is helpful. And how could services be improved? This is a very highly unscientific analysis of what people have said in the free text boxes. How could they be improved? Information, and good quality information seems to stand out. And that's from about 170 respondents just searching their free text. So those are the questions. I'm sure your questions are much more interesting than ours and much more pertinent to today's experience. And I'd just like to acknowledge everybody here that I've tried to stand up and talk on behalf of, and these are some of our funding organisations. But particular thanks to Mariana Vandenbury, who leads the whole thing, and Professors Owen and Jeremy Hall, who's my boss. So thanks very much for your time.